Henri Bergson was a French philosopher whose work profoundly influenced both philosophy and other disciplines such as literature, psychology, and biology. He is best known for his ideas on time, consciousness, and the idea of intuition as a method of knowledge. His popular works include Time and Free Will, Matter and Memory, Creative Evolution, and the Two Sources of Morality and Religion. Bergson's philosophy emphasizes the importance of intuition as a source of knowledge. He argued that reality cannot be fully grasped through the intellectual analysis alone. Rather, it must be experienced intuitively. He believed that intuition allows us to access the deeper, more dynamic aspects of reality that are often overlooked by rational thought. One of Bergson's key concepts is that of duration, which he distinguishes from spatialized time. Duration refers to the continuous flow of subjective experience, which cannot be divided into discrete moments like objective, measurable time. Bergson famously described this concept in his book, Time and Free Will, where he argued against the idea of time as a series of static moments and instead proposed that it is constantly changing individual whole. Bergson also explored the nature of consciousness, arguing that it is inherently dynamic and creative rather than static and passive. He believed that consciousness is constantly evolving and expanding, driven by an underlying life force, or elan vital. In this video, we will focus on what Bergson has to say about the nature of time and how we come to know and understand our temporal experience. All right, so Bergson is one of those philosophers who had a tremendous amount of writing output. So it's very difficult just to talk about one work or one article. And he's also one of those thinkers that wrote on a wide variety of topics. I mean, a lot of his work kind of centers around the scientific developments, the major scientific breakthroughs that are happening at the time. You have to remember Bergson is writing at the tail end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So he's in a lot of ways responding to two of the biggest scientific developments that have ever happened. The first being Darwinian evolution, and the second being the radical changes that occur in physics in the early 20th century. Specifically, of course, Bergson gets in this conversation, this debate with Albert Einstein regarding the nature of relativity. But Bergson's more than just responding to scientific developments. He's also responding to major philosophical developments, specifically those in the 19th century of the writings of Immanuel Kant, and of course the positive movement, which kind of gets its start in France. It becomes incredibly popular in Europe by the mid 20th century. But what I want to focus on for the content of this video is what Bergson has to say about metaphysics and what Bergson has to say about the nature of time. And I should also mention another major philosophical movement that Bergson's kind of responding to is that of phenomenology, which we'll kind of get into a little bit with his description of time. But that being said, there are some major works of Bergson that I'm going to be drawing from here. So I want to go ahead and lay it out. And this is also for your reference. If you're interested in the things that I have to say, if you find Bergson an engaging thinker, you might want to follow these up. All of these works are available, of course, through an English translation. Most of these can be found as PDFs for free online if you're interested, or for very cheap on Amazon if you want a physical copy. But Bergson becomes known for what he has to say about time. And if you're interested in the kind of debate that he has with Einstein, I have a separate video about the Bergson-Einstein debate that I'll list in the description of this video. But Bergson's engagement with physics and his engagement with the experience of time actually happens several decades prior to his engagement with Einstein. You can see that reflected in his first work, Time and Free Will, which was published in 1889. Now, to be clear, Bergson has a background in mathematics as well as philosophy. And what he's interested in, I might do a separate video on this. There's a very interesting development that's happening with respect to the kind of intersection of physics on the one hand, philosophy on the other, and the emerging discipline of psychology. it's easy to forget, but psychology as a distinct and separate discipline really didn't distinguish itself until the early 20th century, at least in terms of academically distinguish itself. Now, you have some precursors, of course, in the 19th century. I'm thinking of people like in America, you have William James. In Europe, you have Freud and eventually Jung, that will become distinctly, we will identify as distinctly as studying psychology. But specifically in France in the late 19th, early 20th century, there wasn't a clear line drawn between philosophy and psychology. So a lot of what Bergson is interested in, the kind of phenomenological experience of time, yes, which is distinctly philosophical in approach, but also he's got a kind of a background and a precursor to what we would now identify as psychology, and you can kind of see that come to the forefront in books like Time and Free Will. Now, of course, I'm approaching this mostly from a history of science perspective, so my perspective on Bergson's writing is going to be a little skewed here, but just to reveal my cards there. So Time and Free Will, he's going to talk about the experience of time. And for Bergson, we'll kind of discuss this a little bit later. For Bergson, the experience of time is summarized in our intuitive experience of duration, extended time, the self extended through time. But again, we'll come back to that. Related to this understanding of time, and this is why I bring in psychology, Bergson's also really interested in this question of memory, of what exactly memory is and how exactly memory functions. And so in his second book, Matter and Memory, published in 1896, he's going to talk a lot about the relationship between time and memory and further unpack, especially in the last chapter of Matter and Memory, the relationship between time and memory. He has a really interesting essay that he publishes called An Introduction to Metaphysics in 1903. This is going to get to the knowledge distinction I'm about to talk about here between relative and absolute knowledge that he introduces. There's a really close connection here if you're interested kind of in the continental tradition with what Bergson's saying in this essay, and also between other thinkers such as Martin Heidegger, who also writes like a brief introduction on metaphysics. Bergson will expand on this in a later work, or like a full-length book that he publishes called The Creative Mind, but his entire essay on the introduction of metaphysics, again, can be found online. And finally, and this is where we get into Bergson's proper response to Einstein himself. And again, I'll reference that video, but there are a couple of different encounters. Einstein, of course, publishes his first papers on what we would now identify as relativity theory in 1905. But shortly thereafter, Einstein will go kind of on tour, kind of promoting these ideas and talking about the new developments in physics throughout Europe. He'll reach France. I want to say like 1908, 1910 is when he does his first series of lectures in France. Of course, World War One puts a damper on all of that. And then following World War One, we get another tour. And it's in 1920 that Bergson and Einstein will have their kind of famous encounter. I would highly recommend a book called The Physicist and the Philosopher. I'll link that book in the description of this video. It's an incredibly detailed account of the debate and the discussion that happens. But I bring that up because it's in response to that debate that Bergson publishes Duration and Simultaneity in 1922, 2 years after that conversation he has with Einstein. And it's here that he'll further clarify, and we'll talk about this at the end of the video, what exactly he thinks the difference, the problem between, I don't know if I really want to call it a problem, the distinction between a metaphysical or a phenomenological approach to the study of time, and then what physics gives us with respect to the study of time. So in that essay I referenced, An Introduction to Metaphysics, Bergson opens up the essay by distinguishing between two different ways of knowing, two different ways we come to knowledge, two different ways we know things. The first way he calls a relative way. This distinction gets a little maybe difficult to comprehend. The language relative and absolute might be a bit problematic for some of you who are listening. But what he means by this is the first type of knowledge, relative knowledge, he says is knowledge kind of, so you have an object or an experience that we're trying to have knowledge of. The first type of knowledge is knowledge around that object. It's knowledge offered by descriptions of that object. These comes in the form of symbols, according to Bergson. Now, symbols can mean a couple of different things here. So for one, it can mean like language, a description of the object via language, a linguistic analysis or a linguistic explanation of the object. But of course, one of the things that Bergson really has in mind here are mathematical symbols and mathematical description of the object. And with the second form of knowledge, so the first form of knowledge he calls relative knowledge, the second form of knowledge he calls absolute knowledge. And this is knowledge from within the object. Bergson will later say that this knowledge comes from sympathy with the object. It's kind of an insider knowledge, a direct experience of the type of knowledge or the type of experience that we're talking about. Now, I don't think I've done a great job of explaining that. So let me give you an example to explain, I think, what Bergson means here. So, with respect to the first form of knowledge, to explain the difference between these two types of knowledge, consider the example of driving a car. So, practically speaking, information about operating a car can be conveyed in the form of language, in the form of like an operating manual that you get with the car, of somebody sitting next to you explaining to you how to use this car. If we wanted to dig a little bit deeper, we could also relay information about the operating capacity of the car in terms of its kind of performance capabilities, a breakdown of horsepower, the capabilities of the engine, for example. Or we can even analyze the car in terms of mathematical calculations regarding the acceleration capabilities of certain types of cars, 0 to 60 in how many seconds. That I don't know anything about cars, but you get what I'm saying, right? This information, according to Bergson, is relayed from a quote relative standpoint. What Bergson means by relative here is that the information is being conveyed by an individual who is describing the car and not necessarily the individual who has direct experience of driving itself. Which leads us to the second form of knowledge, or the second category of knowing something that Bergson's going to talk about. With this second category of knowledge, Bergson says, and this is a direct quote, we enter into the object of knowledge. Bergson explains that the second form of knowledge does not rely on another individual's point of view or any sort of symbolic medium used to convey the information. Rather, this second form of knowledge is more experiential in nature. This would be the difference between reading an instruction manual about how to operate a car or how to drive a car and actually driving the car yourself. The act of driving a car can be described linguistically or displayed in mathematical symbols regarding acceleration and stuff like that. However, the person who is actively doing the driving doesn't necessarily need to describe the experience in order to have knowledge of it. The act itself is kind of what brings the knowledge. They are within this is what Bergson means by being in the object, being in the experience itself is relaying a form of knowledge. Okay, so it's this second form of knowledge that leads us to what Bergson has to say about the method of intuition. So Bergson argues that we come to the second form of knowledge via the process of intuition. And with intuition comes a special kind of knowing related to the living creatures or the individuals, the humans' experience of that phenomenon. The intuitive ability of this individual is not governed by their kind of intellectual capability of breaking down or symbolizing the experience, but rather what Bergson calls their sympathy with the experience, with the thing that's considered. So, an intuitive way of knowing something, according to Bergson, is a knowledge which is gained or gleaned experimentally from within, from the act itself. And Bergson argues that intuition serves as the grounds for metaphysics. So, going back to kind of classical Greek philosophy, we have this division between physics and metaphysics. Now, physics seeks to describe the world around us. You can go take a physics class today in which you're able to mathematically break down things like gravity, motion, acceleration, whereas metaphysics in the realm of philosophy deals with what is real. And what Bergson's saying here is that when we're dealing with the real, it's a very problematic term, but when we're dealing with the real, Bergson's saying that we can have intuitive knowledge of it, and that metaphysics brings us into direct contact with the real. And it does this by getting rid of the symbols that we use, that through the act of symbolizing or describing reality through symbols, we actually kind of distance ourselves from the real. And metaphysics is a getting rid of that and coming back, putting us in direct contact with reality. Metaphysics becomes for Bergson a science with that dispenses with symbols via intuition. Intuition is how we're able to do that. And metaphysics is able to do this because it seeks experiences at its source. And kind of what Bergson means by this is that there are inner states of consciousness that we all have and that we all experience that are fundamental features of our conscious experience of the world, and that these experiences are on some level epistemologically ineffable. Epistemologically, they're not able to be described linguistically. They resist symbolization, according to Bergson. And a problem happens, and this is where we get Bergson's fundamental disagreement with Einstein. And this is where they just could not see eye to eye. And again, I'm going to reference my Bergson Einstein video if you want me to unpack that a little bit more. But Einstein doesn't get Bergson's, I mean, Einstein is versed in philosophy, but he's not versed in Bergson's philosophy. He's not versed in the French tradition. But what Bergson was trying to convey to Einstein is that physics just doesn't capture everything, and that there are something about these inner states. And remember, one of the inner states that Bergson's going to talk about is our concept of duration, is our concept of time. So there's something about our internal experience of time that just can't be conveyed. And that there's a problem that happens. There's kind of a categorical error that occurs when we try to take those inner states and we try to explain them symbolically. Now, to highlight this point, Bergson goes back to a very famous Greek paradox, Zeno's paradoxes of motion, that I want to spend a little bit of time explaining because I think it highlights kind of what Bergson is saying here. Okay, so there are a couple of different iterations and variations of Zeno's paradox. One is the arrow in flight. The other is Achilles and the tortoise. Of course, if you're like me and you grew up watching cartoons in the 90s, you may also be familiar with the Looney Tunes rendition of the tortoise and the hare. It's the same sort of principle. So I'm going to use Bugs Bunny and the tortoise. So I'll talk about Achilles and the tortoise, but same idea here. So Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise is a thought experiment that aims to demonstrate the concept of infinite divisibility, the divisibility of space between Achilles and the tortoise, and the paradox that can lead to the infinite divisibility of space. In the paradox, Achilles, who's a swift runner, races against a tortoise, who is obviously, of course, very slow. However, the tortoise is given a head start because Achilles, or in this case, Bugs Bunny, is confident in his ability. According to the paradox, Achilles can never overtake the tortoise because in the time it takes Achilles to reach the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise will have moved forward, albeit by a smaller distance than Achilles has moved. This process of having the distance continues indefinitely, suggesting that Achilles will never catch up to the tortoise despite his superior speed. The paradox highlights the concept of infinite divisibility of space, raising questions about the nature of motion and whether continuous movement is possible. Now, there's been several different responses to these paradoxes over the course of the history of philosophy. Of course, Aristotle was the first person to respond to Zeno's paradoxes. But Bergson will also respond because for Bergson, these paradoxes highlight this kind of categorical error that I was talking about before. The fault in these paradoxes, according to Bergson, comes from the identification of this series, the series of numbers between Achilles and the tortoise, between the series of acts, such as the identification of this series with a homogeneous idea of space which underlies them, the ability to continually divide up that space between Achilles and the tortoise. The motion of Achilles, argues Bergson, however, is not synonymous with the mathematical conception of space which the paradox is predicated on. To illustrate this point, Bergson uses the example of a shooting star. The event, as experienced by the individual, starts at one point, point A, in the night sky, and ends at a separate point, point B. Between point A and point B are a mathematically infinite amount of points which one could attempt to trace the trajectory of the event, much like Achilles moving to reach the tortoise. Bergson, in order to escape the clutches of the paradox, explains that with the shooting star, we are not just dealing with an object, but rather with progress, with motion, insofar as it is a passage from one point to another. It's a mental synthesis that happens. It's a psychic experience. Psychic is a mental experience, not psychic as in like a tarot card reader, and is therefore an unextended process. So the primary issue here in the paradox between Achilles and the tortoise, according to Bergson, is like, yes, we can mathematically describe space, and we can mathematically divide it to an infinite degree because numbers are infinite, but motion isn't. And motion, according to Bergson, is more than just mathematically moving from point A to point B, that there's an aspect that consciousness brings to the table here. So ultimately, what Bergson is arguing is that anytime we're dealing with quantification or the quantification of an object, going back to that first form of knowledge that we talked about at the beginning of the video, that there is an implicit spatial assumption in such quantification. So the example that Bergson gives to talk about this is the example of counting sheep, when the shepherd is attempting to count the sheep in his flock. When the shepherd attempts to do this, the spatial assumption comes in that with the quantification of the sheep, the shepherd is kind of glossing over the individuality of each sheep, the individual characteristic that makes that sheep, and rather treating each sheep as a mathematical unit. And in this mathematical unit, they're able to treat the herd as a whole, as a sum. And in order to separate one sheep from another, we have to input this idea of this spatial quality or quantity between the sheep to make one sheep separate and distinct from another. The problem that Bergson's saying is that we just can't do that with certain mental states. So if you think, for example, of mental states like certain emotions like joy, anger, love, hatred, that there are distinctive qualities, like we can experience varying degrees of intensity of love. It was just Valentine's Day prior to me filming this, right? We can experience various intensities of love, but it really wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, or it would kind of get pedantic if we were then to kind of divide up those different intensities into different types of love, to quantify love. That love itself, for Bergson anyway, is more of a qualitative experience that we can experience over the course of a day, of a month, or even over a few decades. And that, yes, it might vary in levels of intensity, but we're still dealing with this kind of continuous experience of love, at least from an internal, if we're talking about internal conscious states, at least from an internal perspective. So the question here is, well, that's all well and good, but how exactly does this relate to time? What does this have to say about time? And going back to those two different types of knowledge, Bergson will draw a distinction between two different types of time. The first type of time, which we can know from relative ways of knowing, is mechanical or mathematical time. This is physical time. This is time as it's able to be described by mathematical formula. And concerning this type of time, Bergson says that time enters into the formula of mechanics, into the calculations of the astronomer, and even physicist, under the form of quantity. It is a mathematical time. But that this mathematical time doesn't capture all of time as it is, that there's another type of time. And that other type of time is what Bergson calls internal conscious time, the experience of duration. And this is what Bergson has to say about that experience: that science cannot deal with time and motion except on condition of first eliminating the essential and qualitative element of time, duration, and of motion and mobility. So there's this distinction between mathematical, quantitative time and the conscious experience or qualitative time. And this is kind of what Bergson is getting at when he has that conference, that debate with Einstein in 1920, that there's just something missing from physics. There's just something that science can't fully answer, can't fully grasp even. And that's the conscious experience, these internal states that Bergson is talking about. So that is all I got for this video. I hope that you got something out of my overview of Bergson. If you have any questions about Bergson and his philosophy, I'm more than happy to do my best to answer those. If you want to put those in the comments section below, I'll do my best to respond to you. Also, feel free to check out those books. I'll link the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on Bergson if these ideas kind of interest you. And yeah, I guess that's it for this video. I'll see you all next time.